Welcome to our second Making a Meaning lecture. We have the pleasure of having our graduate program director here with us, Hernan Diaz Alonso. I'll do a very short introduction. Hernan is a friend, a dear colleague, and also an inspiration. Believe it or not, he works incredibly hard. I don't know how he does it because he looks like he's never busy, but the amount of work that they manage to produce is in a large quantity on the one side, and amazing quality, and always, for sure, an intrigue. One of the things that I think that we know the problem of the white sheet of paper. That's sort of the problem of inspiration, you know, the problem of attacking a white sheet of paper is always a problem in the creative world. Hernan managed to invent the black sheet of paper as a starting point for any type of ideas. So please welcome Hernan Diaz Alonso. Let's see what he does with our black paper. Thank you.
Well, unless I guess we invented something. Can we turn off the light so these good people can sleep? Before we start, would it be possible to get a bottle of water?
Water?
Yeah. Or, I didn't mean you.
No,
You have 70 people you can send. All right, okay, so I never know exactly when, every time I have to do a lecture for Making a Meaning, that Alessi dragged me into it, is I should give a lecture that encourages you to be an architect, or I should give you a lecture that push you away and go and do something productive with your life. Because I really think that architecture is an extraordinary discipline and a beautiful discipline. I cannot say the same about the profession. I think that there is a kind of we're an interesting time in architecture, but I guess that at any given time in history we can say that. I mean, it always seems that architecture seems to be in some sort of a moments between utopia and oblivion, or success and failure. So I will not argue in those terms. I think any given time is a particular complicated time for architecture, and it's particularly an exciting time for architecture. It all depends how each of us would choose to frame how to operate and how to work in relation to it. Let me show you a clip that I think it captures very well what I think is what we do at the office.
Hi. You know, I don't want there to be any hard feelings between us, Harvey. When you and Rachel were being abducted, I was sitting in Gordon's cage. Now, I didn't rig those charges.
Your man, your plan.
Do I really look like a guy with a plan? You know what I am? I'm a dog chasing cars. I wouldn't know what to do with one if I caught it. You know, I just do things.
Okay, so there's many things I always like about the clip, even though despite the recent circumstances about what happened in Denver and so on, that maybe I should stop using this clip for a while, but at the same time, anyway, I think that clip to me is always interesting because this idea that you may feel that you operate, that you don't have a traditional plan, but you have a certain logic about how to do things. And there is something that I like it better, which is kind of from doing stuff, and you just do stuff. And in that sense, I think it's one of the things that we have in common with what you guys are doing in Making a Meaning, and certainly something I have in common with Alexi's approach to architecture. Maybe you will find after the lecture that it seems that we may not have that many things in common in the approach, but for sure we have that idea in common, that architecture is an idea, architecture is a discipline, architecture is a craft, then it happens by doing it. I don't think it's, of course we speculate, And now, what that doing means, it means different things for different people. And not everybody thinks that architecture is a building. Some people think it's that. Some others, we think architecture is more than a building. Architecture is much more a way to understand the world, and architecture is a way to understand culture. And I want to be very, very clear about that. For me, architecture is a cultural practice. It's not an art and craft. It's not, and again, you don't need to quote me on that, and it's really important for you to understand two things. This lecture is a lecture on my own work. It's not a lecture about what Sayre says, Sayre says about architecture. Sayre doesn't have one monolithic voice. Sayre doesn't have one only way to think architecture. Sayre has as many ways to think architecture as faculty and students we have. And it's really, really important for me that you understand that difference. So what I'm talking about right now, I'm talking about my own work, my office work. It's not, which some of those ethos bleed into what I do as a teacher, and for sure it bleeds in what I do as a head of the program, but that doesn't mean that that's what I think that is the ethos of the program or is the ethos of Sayre. That being said, I like to think that all the people that we are involved in Sayre, we share a big chunk of overall ideas about what architecture is. For sure, we all think that architecture is an agent of change, and architecture is a vehicle to be progressive, to be radical, to be provocative. I will argue that most of the faculty here share that thought. I just want to make clear about that disclaimer because I will feel like an ethical responsibility that, especially for young, new students like you guys, that you don't confuse my personal position with Sayre position. There's a little bit of both in there, but it's not one. The other thing which I want to mention, usually in the lectures I tend to talk a lot at the beginning and then we shoot the stuff, is I think there's a couple of things of, let's say, Anglo-Saxon or American academy that I never liked much. One is this notion that you should detach your own individual biography about what you do. I always think that always happens, but not only always happens, you should embrace that. You should not deny what your own interest, don't deny your own naive or almost childish desire about why you wanted to be an architect. In my case, the funny thing is I didn't want to be an architect. I wanted to be a filmmaker. I wanted to study film. I wanted to be a film director. I didn't want to be an architect when I was younger than you guys, because in Argentina we had to choose what we want to do when you're 18th, which is a pretty fucked up thing when you think about it, because what do you know what you want when you're 18th, but you had to choose what career you're going to do. Anyway, I wanted to be a filmmaker. It's a long story, and I'm going to tell the whole thing, but bottom line, the film school was closed, so I had to do something, because if not, I had to do the military service at that time. So I thought architecture was better to be in the military service, and so I signed into architecture with the hope that then I will transfer back to film school eventually. So anyway, that didn't happen. Architecture became really interesting to me, and it became like a thing I thought I can work on it. So I stay in architecture. That doesn't mean that my own desires or individual desires about films and cinematic logic didn't perspire in the work that we do. And that became really, really useful and very direct when I started to work in around 98, 99, when I came to study in America, in New York, in Columbia, with the whole, it was the middle of the transformation of computational and animation software and all that coming to architecture. So for me, that became like a super important blueprint how to operate. It was an opportunity to combine a lot of my individual desires with the discipline I was working. So a big chunk of the work that we produce comes from a cinematic ambition to produce effects that relates more to cinema than relate to architecture effects, with the condition that architecture can produce desire. Which again, it works much better in an artistic endeavor than maybe works in architecture, but that's one of the things. So these are a series of principles that I think that remain stable for the last 10 years or so, which is more or less the work I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you the evolution of the office work in the last 10 years. And it's also predicated on a series of kind of a more conventional takes. One, form follows forms instead of form follows function, which is kind of the modernist axiom. And maybe some of you are familiar with that, some of you are not. The other one, if you're interested in the formalist project, if you're interested in a kind of a formal approach to architecture, Almost by default, I would say you're interested in the problem of aesthetics, and if you're interested in the problem of aesthetics, you are interested in the problem of beauty. Now, that's being said, contemporary cultural conditions and social and techniques and technology, it keep redefining all the time what are the means and the vehicles for that production. So the one that we try to use, and I'm interested in developing, is the notion of the grotesque and the horrific as alternative mechanism for the production of beauty. And I will elaborate that as we go by. The other two, image and editing, to me, these are critical shifts in the last 20 years in relation to architecture. Historically, architecture has been through the control of the production of geometry to produce form. Now, I would argue, since we use computers and so on, that image has become the vehicle for the production of form, even through renderings or even the drawings that you produce through a computer, that are really the image of it and not the pure act of geometry. Of course, this is up to debate and it's a polemic take, but to me it's a super important one, and it was another way for me to wrap it up back to the problem of the cinematic ambitions. The other one, which I think is super interesting, is that editing has become a much more viable way to think about than composition. I think composition used to be much more linear and flat way to think about the problem of that. Now I think we can, through the new techniques and technologies, allows us to work in a back and forth and non-linear way through editing. And the last two, again, are kind of personal. One is the notion of virtuosity. I have an obsession with virtuosity, in this case, computational and formal virtuosity. It's my own aspiration with the work that we produce that have a virtuoso quality, but also is to be very honest about my own interests and the artists that I like, the musicians that I like, the filmmakers that I like. They all operate on virtuosity. They never operate on cleverness. And you will find that later on in your career, for those of you who goes into architecture, and for those of you who already choose to be in architecture, that there are many ways to define architecture, but the one I find the favorite is there is virtuoso architecture and there is clever architecture. And I think both of them are valid. I'm on the virtuoso side. My work is never clever, in the sense the work is what it is. So it relies on the ability of doing it and relies on the ability of the technique. I like that over clever. Anyway, as I said, it's not the only way. And the last one have to do with the possibility that architecture had the aspiration to produce lust and to produce arousal. We're not going to get into that one now. Anyway, so moving on. So there's a couple of things and people that I consider incredibly influential in my work, and I think it's always important for you guys to be very open about that and trying to figure it out how you can use it. In my case, the work of Francis Bacon, the British painter, is a super important one for many reasons. One, because I'm fascinated by the aesthetics that he produced, but secondly, because I find the way that he operates and the way that he thinks about painting to be incredibly architectonic. In this way, the work of Francis Bacon, unlike the work of Pablo Picasso or unlike the work of Marcel Duchamp or many of the previous artists, doesn't trade on the possibility that is new. Actually, Bacon used very traditional techniques of painting that come from the Renaissance, oil painting, portrait techniques. So his obsession was not about to produce new techniques. It was not produce a rupture with the discipline. It was to understand and go deep into the root of the discipline and see how he can subvert it or revolt it from the inside and produce innovative, affective or effects or sensations out of that. And to me, that is a really important point, because architecture cannot produce new. And this I'm willing to argue to whoever in the world of architecture, and I can win that argument every time, I think. Architecture is not a discipline that is trading new. It's a big mistake for anybody to think that you will do anything new. What you can do is to be innovative, to reconfigure it. It's a discipline that built in a very long trajectory, in a very long, heavy history, and you cannot escape. And that's what I always like the work of Bacon, because it reminds me of that. The other one, which is very important to me, is the simplicity of the problem to understand the construction of form and the construction of geometry. I really think, and this is probably one of the places that Alexis and we don't look eye to eye, is that as architects, we don't make buildings. What we make are intellectual speculations about the problem of architecture, and those produce documents that somebody else will build. In my case, in Alexis' case, it's not the case. He tends to build his own thing, which I find repugnant and repulsive. But I think it's a very valid one, and it produces an incredibly sophisticated body of work too. But I think it's important for you guys to know what each of us will stand for it, and to keep in mind that none of us have the truth on that. That is not only way to think about the problem of architecture. But mine, it has to do with this logic, which is the kind of abstract construction of geometry and the production of architecture at that level. This is from the architect who was my hero, and in many regards, a mentor without him knowing that he was a mentor. It's one of those weird things. It's Enric Miralles, a Catalan architect who died in 2000 when he was only 45. I worked for him for a while. I consider him one of the most important figures in the last 50 years, if not the most important one. But he died too young, but he left a huge body amount of work. But basically, what he was obsessed was with figuring out how the conventional way of production of drawings can convey very unconventional attitudes towards the work. In this case, it's called how to lay out a croissant. And it was one of the exercises that he speculated when he was still as a student. Anyway, so moving on into my own work, early on in the work, this is circa 99 to 2001, all these projects. The project at the beginning, the works that we were producing, what we were trying to get in relation to animation software, Maya, Alias Studios, whatever it was at the time, there were projects that they were heavily relying on that condition of the technique. So that's what I call it experiments. One of the words, a couple of words that you're going to hear very often in discussions of architecture and so on, is the notion of experimental research and blah, 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 and we use it like they're interchangeable. I don't think that's the case. I think experiments are when you're shooting in multiple directions without knowing exactly what you want to get out of it. I think research is when that start to amount to some kind of a coherent one. So in any case, all this project was about the idea of a singular surface trying to organize everything. I mean, that was a limited thing, and it was based on spline and nerve surfaces and a whole series of computational things that were available to us. Out of all those experiments, we only managed to build a small gallery installation here in SCI-Arc 10 years ago. Out of those series of experiments, this project became important because it started to define a much more clear agenda. So in a way, I was kind of playing around with certain series of ideas and ambition. The other thing that you discover is you only work on the same ideas again and again and again. That's why I am a strong believer in the development of techniques, because I think at the heart of the ideas, you always work on the same idea since you were 20 or since you were an architect. I discover that every day about my own work. That's why I don't believe so much in the power of ideas. I believe much more in the power of developing methodologies of work and logics of work. I'm always much more interested in how than what. That doesn't mean that the what is not important. What I mean is that the what, you don't need to be rediscovering the what all the time. You don't need to be rediscovering new ideas all the time. When you need to be rediscovering is a different way how to approach those ideas. Anyway, this project was a competition for the U2, the rock band in Dublin, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. The only thing was interesting is that this was the first time in the British press that they talk about that this was a grotesque project. And I thought, well, that's strange. I mean, I never thought of the problem of the grotesque. So I started to explore in the problem of the grotesque. And I realized that we tend to confuse the notion of grotesque in the sense of, the second episode is a lot the same. The notion of the grotesque is, we tend to use it like it's something disgusting or something that we find repulsive. The truth is the origin of the notion of grotesque comes from the period of painting, in particular Francisco Goya when he was doing the Black Period, in which what he was painting didn't fit with any of the canon of aesthetics of that given time. So when the people start to write about it, they're talking about the grotesque. So the grotesque is not necessarily something repulsive or disgusting, but it's something that doesn't fit with the aesthetic canons of a particular time. So one of the things that to me is super interesting about computers and computational work, and I'm not interested to talk about digital architecture anymore because this is the canon, and for you guys who started to work in many, you guys are using computers, is the canon, is what it is right now, nobody think about it. But for people like me who were involved in the process of transformation on that, there was a whole series of ideological, philosophical things at stake. And one of the most interesting things to me was there was a whole series of new aesthetics emerging out of this. Then we realized they were not that new, that there were certain kind of grotesque, and basically it was because it produced a kind of an unfamiliar territory aesthetic quality. So the notion of grotesque became an important one. To put it in other ways, Grotesque is an emerging quality. You cannot design, you cannot aspire to it. It's almost the opposite of cute. You know when somebody says, hey, I have a friend I want you to meet. He or she, whatever is your brand of vodka, right? And you ask, is he or she beautiful? And your friend will say, not really, but she's cute. So you know that they mean something else. So grotesque had to do with that. It's not really a precise definition of aesthetic, but it has to do more with the kind of sensation quality. Now, as I said, you cannot choreograph that, but you can choreograph and orchestrate horrific, which is an interesting way to produce beautiful conditions. So when you think about the movie like Psycho of Alfred Hitchcock, the famous sequence in the shower, well, nobody gets scared about that, but in 58 you get scared. You can choreograph the reaction and the audience will feel at that particular moment if you put the right music, the right speed of the camera there. So there's a whole series of things that you can line up and to do that. And architecture is in a way to do that. So the animation that I'm showing to you is what we present to the jury at PS1 for Museum of Modern Art in New York for the Pavilion Summer competition that they write every year. And this was the first time that we really start to work with the notion of animations and cinematic, not as a way to show the project, but as a way to think and to understand the project. So every maneuver that we will do for the project will have this kind of a camera cinematic quality. So the desire for this project was to operate almost like the first Alien or Ridley Scott, in which you can never fully understand the whole thing. You only have like partial things because the horror is more horror when you don't get to see the whole thing. Anyway, it happens that we won. And the other thing that it was interesting about this pavilion, and this was the one that became clear to me, that I was obsessed that the things that we built, that this is the built pavilion, will look as close as we can to the render, and not the other way around. So it's a kind of a self-artificiality, and it's one of the things that I embrace, that you're going to see in most of the renders that we produce, that there's never a desire to make it look like a real render. We never want them to look like a real building, because we want the reality to look more like the image in the screen, and not the other way around. I think that the screen and the computer and the obsession with the image and the black background is way more interesting than the real world, to me. So when we finished, Alexis was absolutely instrumental for us to build this. I mean, the first thing I did when I won was to call Alexis and say, hey, dude, we want this. We have 70 days to work it, to build it. Shitty budget. You're in. And of course, he was in, and we pulled it together somehow for at least 2 weeks until it fell apart. But fuck it, that's how it goes. But in any case, what it was interesting about the other project also was, if you remember the early project I was showing you, Singular Surfaces, and this one was the desire to start to work with evolution of a genetic code and idea of a species. So each of the pieces come out of a singular form. So topologically, they're all the same pieces. It's the whole same information or mathematical thing in each of the pieces. Anyway, so we will produce a whole series of projects based on this idea of cells that can mutate and evolve and transform. And for this, we did, it was something almost like close to 1,500 pieces for the structure. None of them were the same. We had to come with different ways how to build it and fabricate it, cut it and bend it and so on. When you're in the middle of this, you start to realize, why the fuck I'm not a minimalist? Because life will be much easier. But anyway, we did it, it got built. It got built 24 hours in advance. So we were finished before the open, and this is on the opening, blah, blah, blah. And I think we fucked it up for later on for everybody else, because after that, all the one that they chose was incredibly conservative. So, but what was interesting about that, and I'm a strong believer in the autopsy process of working. I mean, this is something that I literally stole from Enric Miralles, which is the idea that the afterthought, that just do things and then figure it out what it means, became the genesis for the next project. So whatever the first project, whatever the project generates, then the logic of that project became the genesis of the next one. So I always like to work in the office in 3 or 4 projects at the same time, and if possible, in different scales. So the notion of this possibility that we can create cells that we can mutate and variate, it was really useful and interesting to me, because we can start to move away from the point of type or typology and move to an approach to understand the families of form and the families of projects as an object of a species. Meaning that you will have certain kind of a codes that are shared for multiple projects, but they all can transform into something else. One thing. The second one is that you start to get potentially more work, and the office start to grow, and then you don't have the time to model everything yourself, and you have to have a group of people that work with you. And so it's really important that you develop a methodology. For me, the genetic code was an interesting way because it was a way for me to work and say, okay, I can work in the basic primitives or the basic cells, and then give it to the guys in the office, and then we can develop there. So until PS1, I was heavily involved modeling myself into the project. Like PS1, I think I modeled the thing by myself, almost like 80% of the thing I did by myself. After that, the work will start to change, and right now I got to the point that I almost don't model much anymore because other things like being in the school and traveling and other things. But so certain kind of a conceptual transformation come out of the necessity. Some of them come from kind of intellectual desire and intellectual evolution. But my point is, every circumstances, every condition that define your work, you have to be able to see it as an opportunity to rethink and refine how you operate. I mean, sooner or later, and this will happen to Alexis, he will not be able to go and build by himself the thing, so he's going to have to figure it out, other logics in which he have to work. I mean, it happens to all of us. It's part of it. That's what I'm saying. You can see it as a downside, or you can see all of these things are opportunities to reframe all the time the way that you think about these things. To me, that's what I think teaching and in building involvement academic is so important, because I cannot imagine the way that we work without teaching. And for me, teaching, practice, art, industrial design, and the other things that we do, which are derivative from architecture, they are all like the same legs of a table, so they all can intertwine one way or another. This was a solo show that we did at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, because we don't get that many architecture commissions. When we get museums, exhibitions, and stuff like that, we always push to see if we can build or fabricate something that goes beyond the traditional exhibition. For one, and second, because I'm always interested in the conceptual frame that you don't show. I like the magician's idea. I mean, I like the idea that you don't show the process. What we do, we have the incredibly sophisticated process, but I never have any interest in show the process or discuss the process or the merit of the process. I find that to be like an incredibly moralistic approach to architecture, much more interested in the result. So when we do an exhibition, the idea is that you work, in any case, the other thing is technology. Like in PS1, like in this, we use a lot of cutting-edge technology, but also we use a lot of handmade technology and traditional technology. You have to combine both. Architecture works more, and for once, I don't care which one get you there as far as get you there. And I think this is really important for you guys, that architecture is a combination of that. That be aware of the religious songs that they tell you that technology takes care of everything. It doesn't. You have to have an idea, you have to have a concept, you have to have an ideology, you have to have a sensibility that you want to develop. But in any case, the show, it will take you to the thing, you see the cells, and then we will go into the main room when we will have this display system with models of different projects. Then it traveled to the Art Institute in Chicago for another solo show that it was larger, but we make it include of that. So these pieces are not anymore singular cells, but they mutate into larger things. So at that time, I was looking into coagulated blood and how the cells transform. So I have a taste, always an obsession for disgusting stuff and disturbing stuff. I always think they are way more inspiring to figure out how you produce beauty about things that are not that beautiful. So the idea, so there are like multiple tracks in parallel. One, you have a series of external interests that drive your work, and there are internal technique mechanisms. In this case was about, okay, how we make multiple cells to become like organs or a larger system, and how then we don't trade anymore in variation and repetition, but we trade on uniqueness. How you transform that. This was a version for the exhibition at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, which we're still working 6 years later. The show hasn't happened yet. We're working in another version again, because every time we go over budget. We were supposed to open last year. It got moved 3 years, so who knows. In any case, moving forward within the work and the ambitions of it, as it goes, the work, instead to be anchored in a fake sense of reality, I get more and more obsessed with kind of a science fiction understanding of reality and how this notion of a species and understanding architecture projects and a continuing evolving series of a species quality This was an invited competition that we did for a house outside Paris for Natalie Ceruzzi, which is an art collector. And in this case, a couple of things that we learned along the way, it looks like every piece is different, but it's not. There are like 3 systems, 3 cells, one that respond to structure, one to respond to skin, one to respond to the ground, that are repetitive, but it produces the effect of non-repetition. But the other thing that was interesting about that, it was the idea to understand the house not as a singular entity, but as much more like a kind of almost like an ecosystem of different elements that can interconnect with each other. But the other thing that was interesting, this was the first project that we used a little bit, and we flirt a little bit with scripting and the idea of transforming behavior within the geometry that is independent from the design and manipulation. I'm not so sold on scripting or robots or any particular technology. I'm interested with the notion of technology big time. I'm interested, but what fascinates me the more about computers and current technologies and techniques is the possibility of the construction of worlds or like astral worlds or autonomous worlds. That's what fascinates me the more. The thing I like the most about technology that is produced like a kind of a very interesting detachment, possibly from reality. Now, when I look back and I think now, I would argue that the notion of science fiction is not so interesting. I think it's much more, and even the physical models, they always have this kind of a flavor to be unreal. Sorry. I would argue, looking back, that this notion of science fiction is less interesting to me. I'm much more interested now, I would say, in the notion of fringe architecture. This idea is not science fiction, it's not fantasy, it's like a parallel reality that can operate at any given time. So in the work has its own internal evolution. This was for a solo show that we did at the MAC Museum in Vienna. And in this case, the idea was to work backwards. I mean, to work from the imperfection on the lack of precision on the geometry, almost against the grain that we've been doing for 6 or 7 years by then. And to try to figure out if we can work backwards, if we can produce with kind of a formless or amorphic thing and shaping into a kind of a more formal one. That was the one. And the other one was the desire that in this particular show, we wanted to capture all the cinematic quality that they were always put in the screen. We were trying to figure it out if we can put it into the physicality of the show itself. So what we ended up producing were a series of objects, 18 of them, that they were displayed in a very long gallery and that we painted all in black. It's called Pitch Black from the very bad Vin Diesel movie. I'm always interested in films, but I'm always interested in very shitty films. I don't use Fellini or Antonioni or all the sophisticated filmmakers and people like to talk in academic. I like blockbuster crappy movies for inspirations because I'm much more interested in the hi-fi, lo-fi idea. I like the idea to take a cheesy notion and transform it into something sophisticated. But in any case, this one was interesting because the idea when you were there, you can capture the notion of animation and cinematic, and even though the objects were like an artistic size, like an art piece size, there's still an architecture problem because we talk about how we assemble, how we connect it to the legs, how we organize the space, how we are efficient about produce repetition and variation. So in this case, unlike the PS1, the body, the chrome part is always the same, and when we do this, we slightly change the legs. And that was enough to produce a huge effect of variation without having to do each piece different. So you learn along the way, you learn that there are certain things that doesn't need to happen in a different way and so on. But also there was a series of beautiful byproducts, like the reflection of these things in the wall. I don't have the pictures of that here, but that it was super interesting. The thing will reflect into the wall. So it was like a completely immersive space, even though when we were designing, we were not thinking about it. So I like the idea that the projects or the things that you build have a life on their own. Probably you realize by now that we have zero capacity to editing the work, to take things out. Every project that we do, we have more shed than the one before. It seems to be the modus operandi of the office, that it trades on exuberance and excess. So everything that we add, so for example, if we start to look into ornament and romanticism in the 19th century as an alternative way to understand the problem of the part of the whole, which is something that always interests me big time in the tradition of architecture, is the problem of the part and the whole is a fundamental problem in architecture. One of the things that interests me a lot working with computers is the idea of a scaleless, the idea that each part is a whole and each whole could be a part, and the idea that you can operate, that the principle, it can go from building for a museum to a furniture collection to a silverware collection. So in this case, the woman that we did a house that we didn't get, she commissioned us to do like a small pavilion quincho for dinners. That didn't happen. Out of that, we produced a bench for her, and then playing around with that, we developed a chair, which is based on the famous IMS chair, and we apply a series of virus scripting that mutate this thing. And this, which was literally a 24-hour experiment, the Art Institute of Chicago commissioned us the chair. Now we did 5 of them for different collections. So actually, the office made a lot of money out of this stupid 24-hour exercise. I fucking hate this chair. It's like the worst thing that we've ever done. But the lesson here is everything that you do, pay attention to it and put the same care and love, because you never know which one they get built. And you never know which one they go into production. And more likely than not, the one that they go into production are the one that you don't like. Or maybe because they go into production, you end up don't liking it. I don't know, there is something about this not all idea that the worst dream is the one that became reality. So, I mean, certain things, so there's always a kind of a level of unsatisfaction. I never know if we produce such extreme work because it's a way for me to avoid reality and to avoid dealing with it, but at the same time, I like money a lot. So, I don't know, I mean, I have to figure it out, the contradiction of it, because certainly what we do is not gonna make us a lot of money, but on the other hand, I like money. So, I haven't figured it out, and if I have a moment and I'll do it, I'll let you know. Because at the end, I really think that what you do as an architect, you do what you do, and you do what you feel like you should do, and I personally believe that you should never compromise one bit. And if the client doesn't like it, they can go and fuck themselves. There will be another one, and another one, and another one. Because the other thing that you realize, and even if you're willing to compromise and do the most boring version of yourself, still that will be completely against the mainstream of what people consider okay. So either you do like incredibly boring, useless stuff, or you don't. And if you choose not to don't, then it's a kind of a complicated one, and then it becomes a progressive polemic work, and it became an antagonist work, and you have to be willing to live with that. In any case, as the internal evolution of the work goes, this was the Herman Museum here in Los Angeles 4 years ago, I think. They did a big exhibition on the work of John Lautner, which is a terrific Californian architect. I don't know, are you guys doing a field trip to see any of the Lautner houses? Yeah, but not this. No, not this one, but okay. But anyway, you will see, for those of you who saw the Big Lebowski, the Jackie Treehorn house is a John Lautner house, and also appears in Diamonds and Forever, James Bond, and in Charlie Angel, this house. So they invite 4 architects, and they need to add 30% to one of the houses of John Lautner. We got the Chemosphere, it doesn't matter. The point was, this one, again, a museum exhibition, we use an experiment to say, okay, we can accumulate a whole series of techniques and species, and we did over a couple of years. So we have this ornamental structure that can potentially work with that. We have envelope with hairs and pimples and imperfections in the surface. One of the things that always obsessed me is this kind of a perfection that comes out of computer work, how we can make it more dirty without losing the sophistication. But the other thing which was important about this one, it was the first project that we incorporate Platonic geometry. If you see there will be pieces of circles that we never did before. And I thought it was interesting because the moment that you put Platonic geometry, the moment that you put a familiar geometry, it completely changed the effect of it, even though it has certain kind of a horrific, aggressive, borderline disgusting quality. The moment you put circles, for some weird reason, people seems more at ease and it feels more recognizable. So there was something interesting about that. So this was how the house looked, blah, blah, blah. But I thought that it was interesting to explore. And the notion of familiarity and the notion of misfit, it became something that became much more obsessed. The idea that how we can work with something exotic and unusual and combine it with something more familiar. Around the same time, we got the first commission for product design by Alessi. Right now, we do a lot of artwork, industrial design, architecture, and even in the film world. To me, everything is architecture and everything is potentially design. So what I was interested in, and I'll show you that in the latest version, is the notion to produce a collection for mutant manners. Like the manners are mutating, our manners are different. But at the same time was the idea, can we produce a series of scalar effects? So it can produce a silverware collection, or it can produce an art piece for Selfridges in London, or out of the similar formal vocabulary, can we produce a museum? So, but this notion of the misfit and the awkward relationship between a conventional Cartesian geometry or a recognizable series of forms or sensation combined with unrecognizable and unique ones, it became, and I would say it's a topic that is still 3 years later, the work that we do in the office is obsessed about it, even though with a slight tweak and change. But if you can see in the evolution of these cells and accumulation, they always appear at the beginning of the animation, they're getting more and more complexes. In this particular case, this was a project that to me was super interesting to work on it. It was a museum for San Sebastian in Spain, a media museum, but it has an existing building. There was an old tobacco factory. And so you need to keep 50% of the old building. So in a way, this was trying to be like a prosthesis, but also kind of a friction in which two notions of tissue need to coexist. It still is one of the few projects I can look back and I still like it. I mean, everything that I do within a month or two, I tend to hate it, which I think is a healthy thing. This one I still like it when I go back and look at it, even though we did it like 3 or 4 years ago. But what I think that triggers is another interesting with the notion of species and mutations and transformation and mutilations. I don't know how many of you ever saw the old Schwarzenegger movie Total Recall, that they're doing a remake now with Colin Farrell. Any of you saw the old Schwarzenegger movie? So I like the difference between prosthetics versus Quato. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you should go and check it out. I mean, Quato is the leader of the resistance in Mars. He's a little guy who lives inside the other guy. I think it's a much more interesting idea than prosthetics. Even though as a mechanism, as a film effect, it's a prosthetic at that time. Now probably it's digital. So I'm always interested in that kind of a nerd specificity. I mean, what does it mean a prosthetic, a literal prosthetic, and a physical prosthetic? I'm not interested whatsoever in metaphors. When I'm talking about, we were looking into flower, it's literally flowers. Or if we were looking into Quato, it's literally Quato, meaning the cinematic effect, but also how Quato was produced as a makeup operation. There is something really healthy about literality and virtuosity, which don't get me wrong, it's not a matter of honesty. I think honesty is a very overrated virtue, but there is something which I think is very useful to work in those terms. Anyway, that's that, the museum, blah, blah, blah. Another museum. All these are competitions that we lost. The only one that we won were at the beginning, the park, and we won a couple of competitions along the road. Anyway, as I get older, I got more and more interested in rituals, and the notion of ritual and architecture and forms is like a super interesting one. And what I would say is there is a kind of a more and more present desire, and if you guys, for those of you who are already in MR1, please make sure that you will have to see the thesis weekend. But for those of you who are thinking to do architecture later on, I'll recommend you to come to see thesis weekend, and you will see a kind of a more clear idea of the desire to produce imperfection built into the digital domain. And so everybody's looking for mechanisms that allow this contamination. Mine is rituals. Rituals interest me because they have a very low-end, high-end component. It has like a very brutal principle of what the ritual is, what happened at the end, but also the sophistication of the tool and the precision how it needs to be done. So that is my most current obsession, is the idea how you negotiate the sophistication and perfection of something with certain primitive, almost animal instinct to it. These are two of the latest collections that we've been working for Alessi, the Italian company. Their product design. The one in your left is the 2010, the one in the right is 2011, and you can see the transformation and evolution of the work. They all traded in small objects. Some of them are bottle covers, some of them are bottle openers, silverware, centerpieces, and so on. But they are done with the same ambition and speculation than when we do project of architecture. So they have a problem of massing, they have a problem of structure, they have a problem of weight, they have a problem of, in a strange way, of interiority. And they all try to trade on the idea of, which I think is a very important next step for our formalist work, what I call the ritual quality to produce body social modification or social behavioral modification, meaning this is to open the bottle, but this is a silverware collection. So if you were to eat with these elements, you will be in the table, you will have to grab it like this. So it will change the way that you interact with the guy next to you and so on. Yeah, we're manufacturing this, but we're doing it in plastic and chrome them. So it's going to be sold for first-class airlines in Alitalia and a couple of other airlines. They couldn't do the metal. Anyway, so that's one collection, and you can see the ornament and the danger of it. And also, we wanted objects that you feel intimidated by using them. Like you will feel afraid. I mean, people come to your office, especially if you're an architect, you come to your home and you have nice objects, people tend to touch anything. So I wanted to do a collection that people will be afraid to touch. None of them are going into production. I'll show you in a bit the one that we are manufacturing now. This is being done as we speak. I just saw the metal prototype last week. We need to adjust the marketing package because now we figured it out how the engineers can build it and fabricate it, but the focus group didn't like it. It's a chandelier. No, it's a candle holder. And basically the candles, when they melt, it will melt into the metal and the ornament will guide the wax. So the idea is it will not be this perfect shiny thing, but it eventually will be shiny with a lot of red on it, on the wax. So the people in the company showed these images to the focus group and they thought that they were too dark and said, yeah, I mean, if you told me you're going to show it to a 65-year-old women in Milan, I would have prepared a whole different package with flowers and girls and little boys. Anyway, the other one that I'm doing is this bottle opener, which sucks. I used it the other day, I almost cut myself. So we need to refine, so we need to do a couple of adjustments. And they're doing this, also the paperweight. And this one, the bottle opener. And we have to do a new centerpiece. We have to do a whole jewelry line. I mean, again, I never looked to be a product designer, industrial designer, but I embrace it. It's super interesting. It's fun to work. It works directly with the body. Out of that Alessi collection, we also developed a display for them, how they can launch the new products. Not going to happen, but it was cool. In relation to that, this notion of the rituals and the low and the high end, Peter Nover, which was the extraordinary director of the MAC, probably the smartest and courageous guys I ever met in the art world and any other museum. In one of the same guy that he commissioned us the big show in the MAC, and he asked me to do like a small thing here at the MAC Apartments garage, where they were opening them. And the budget was very, very small, and I wanted to work with the problem of color, and I wanted to work with the problem of decay, and I wanted to work with the problem of time and literally time passing. So we took the $3,000. I think this budget was $5,000, something like that. So we took up that $3,500. We went to the flower market, and we spent $3,500 in flowers. And we talked to two wonderful Mexican ladies who will do the flower arrangement for funerals. So she taught the guys in my office how to build a structure out of flowers with little wires. So we built all this kind of structure out of this flower thing, and then we bought off-the-shelf bubbles for display, and we put inside a bunch of DVD players with animations of the office. The show is supposed to be for 2 months, so the flowers start to rot and they start to develop mold, and it started to smell awfully, and it became known as the Mexican funeral. And then eventually all the balls fall into the floor. I mean, it was cheap. It was, I think, only, 300 people saw it. I mean, it was a very small show. But it's probably one of the favorite things that we done in the art world. And this is something I want to keep exploring, decay and mutation. But what was interesting about that, in parallel to that small thing, we were doing this big competition for a big bay in Taiwan. So it has a series of concert hall, ferry terminal, parks, and so on. But there was something really interesting about the notion of flowers that I thought it was really cool. Like, we always been very bad at working with color, but I thought, okay, we produce enough exuberance of flower, enough exuberance of geometry and ornament and so on. What if we start to grow plants into this? So what if the color of the building can change, can smell? So basically, we start to work with a series of projects that start to deal with this problem. This is a small museum pavilion that we are designing for the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum in Vienna. It's the same family who did the Thyssen Museum in Madrid. This is for their contemporary collection, and she doesn't want to have like a regular, conventional museum. So she commissioned three very small museums. Each of them is roughly 6,000 square feet. One is in Patagonia, which is the one I'm doing. Francois Roche is doing one in an island in Croatia. And I don't know who is the third one, which is going to be in the Sahara Desert. So the idea is that she will have this small museum that she can move the collection, but then they can have like a small house so two artists can live there for 6 months and produce a unique body of work. In this one, the way that we thought about this version, this is not the latest version, the current version. I'll show you the current version is one of the next three last projects I'm going to show you. The idea was that design all the parts, that each of the parts is a project by himself. Because I always had the feeling that they will run out of money and we will not be able to do that, the whole thing. So I wanted to make sure that the project is done in such a way that it's kind of like, it will be perpetually incomplete. That it can never be complete and it doesn't matter how many pieces we build. So it's a kind of series of art. And it was really directly borrowed by an accident that happened in the 60s in the Cuban Revolution buildings of the National Dance School by Ricardo Porro, which never got finished because lack of budget, and the whole jungle grew into the thing. So I thought that there was something beautiful and poetic about it. Probably he was not happy that the building never got finished and so on, but I think it was a terrific one. But also what I liked about the Patagonia, south of Argentina, is a radical change between the winter and the summer. So the idea that in the winter the building could be very tetric and almost scary, and then in the summer it can become very flowery and happy. It didn't work too complicated. Also, I didn't like the aesthetic. I think it was becoming too Tim Burton-ish. But nevertheless, we did a big model for it. It was in the Venice Biennale, so we used that to do another of these flower things installations. Anyway, the last thing I want to show you is where the project is right now, which is I call it Ritual plus Rough plus Pampas. I'm like Alexis, I'm from Argentina, and I never have like a very strong connection at the cultural level. But for some weird reason, as you get older and particularly when you become a father, suddenly all your genetic heritage kicks in. I don't know why, I don't know exactly what happened, but I feel the desire that I needed to figure it out in my Argentinian side of the world. So, I literally bump into this idea, which this guy here, his name is Francis Mallmann, and he is probably still the most famous chef in Argentina for the last 30 years, probably with another guy who died, Cato Dumas. And he had this, his family is from France, so he was kind of a pioneer of the really high cuisine in Buenos Aires. He has some of the most famous restaurants in Argentina, and in Punta del Este, like the most bourgeois part of the society. And 3 or 4 years ago, I really don't know what happened, if the guy got divorced or whatever. He sold his restaurants in Buenos Aires, and he bought a piece of land in Mendoza and another piece of land in Patagonia. And he created 2 small restaurants with a small hostel, but fairly primitive, not super luxurious. And he started to do a TV show, which is when I saw this, called The 7 Fires. And what he does is he goes around the most brutal part of the land in Argentina, which is pretty brutal in the south, and he cooked in the way the 19th century gauchos and people from the Pampas used to cook. So he cooked the whole fucking cow in this very primitive structure, and then he mixed it with very sophisticated sauces and other things. So There was something about that I found, this is super interesting to me, and the idea, and it makes sense to this, the idea of the rough with the sophisticated and so on. Then I start to look more, and I bought like a series of books about gauchos, ornaments, and the rituals of gaucho, which it just reinforced this idea of what I was thinking, the idea of the primitive of killing a cow, cutting a cow, cooking it, bloody, and all that, and at the same time the elements that they use to ride horses that are full of ornament and silver. So this kind of a contradiction between those two things, I find it fascinating. The sophistication of the tools and so on. And I thought this is a series of ideas, a concept that I think it could be really interesting to explore in architecture. So the first one that we tried to do, this one was a chair that we developed in Vitra, in which first I wanted the structure to be completely detached from the skin in the way that these guys peel off the cow skin and so on. But also, we used some of the structure that we were developing for I think Alessi. But also, I wanted to do. We find a technique of this Belgian company, who they can it's not plastify, but it's plastilinify. You know, like the exhibition that they did of the human bodies. These are real bodies. That this technique. Well, they developed a similar technique to do that to flowers. So we thought that we can do the fusion of all the thing with that. And after that, with this one, it's almost done. And we're doing this for the woman that commissioned the house in France, and then commissioned us the pavilion, and now commissioned just a bench. So we went from a house to a bench. But finally, at least we're going to get to do the big bench for the garden. This one is being produced as we speak right now in France. The metal part is almost done. We're having some problem with the skin part, but we will figure it out. I mean, because the cow skins that we're finding in Europe are not strong enough, so I think we're going to have to import them from Argentina. But anyway, this is the version I would like to be. That's not her house, but that would be much nicer, with the cows looking at their future. But this is the real thing is going to be done in here, and probably the mesh, jokes aside, is not going to be done out of cow skin. It's probably going to be done out of metal mesh, because it had to be outdoors, and if it rains and so on. So this is how it's going to be in her house. In parallel to that, we are doing now a porcelain lamp and a chandelier for a company in Limoges. All this is porcelain, very old technique, using a lot of new technology for it. We're working with a guy who developed a new formula for porcelain that produced translucency, a very particular translucency. So the idea is to produce these luminary objects that it's not really to produce light like this, it's more to produce affect light. So it's like the old idea of the chandeliers with candles. So it's to produce more like an ambience light. So the one I was just showing is the individual piece, almost like a small lamp for kids. And this is a version that we know from the chandelier, which is a much bigger piece. This one is right now in production, should be in the market by the end of next year. They're huge and massive and very heavy. And you can buy 1, 2, 3, up to 5, and you can combine them, depends on the size of the room. But it's all kind from the structure. We're trying to figure it out. We can make the metal and the porcelain to work as a structure. So the white bubbles, it will be all connected, and then what you can do is change the configuration with the outside component. Porcelain is incredibly resistant and incredibly structural, as far as you don't crack it. But by itself, it's super stable. But if you look at the work, it's taking a completely different kind of a much more dirty, imprecise edges. So I'm being much more obsessed to work with much less precise geometry. So the work has certain kind of exotic quality, but combining this kind of a recognizable geometry with more less precise one. One of the things that we're working right now is a meat sculpture for the Wexner Center in Ohio. Just Kim is as the curator. So the idea is that we use frozen meat to mill it, and then we will combine it with this metal structure. It's not a huge piece. And then we will seal it, and so the meat will not decay. Well, it will decay, but at least it will not smell. So even this sculpture piece, we treat it as an architecture project. I mean, we figured it out, all the construction drawings. But out of this, we're doing a whole series of collection of art pieces. One is for the Ritz-Carlton in Miami, in which one this will be made out of plastic composites and metal. So it's exactly the same families of form that the meat sculpture, but they would make with a material that is much more shiny and precise and so on. So the idea is that you can have a similar formal language, but the completely difference of materiality and effect, it should produce a totally different sensation for each of the art pieces. So this is how it is. This is how we will be placed in Miami. And we work in a different version, which is more based on spheres. Out of that, we produce the latest thing that we did for Alessi is espresso and a cup mug based on that sculpture. This is espresso cup. You can only drink it like this. And the spoon is embedded in the crack. So I want to finish with two projects of architecture. One is a competition that we just finished for the National Library in Helsinki. And in this case, the idea was there was a kind of a series of givens. There was the rectangle of the site that cannot be violated. So we had to produce a bar that was rectangular. But the idea is libraries today are not anymore what they were. So the idea is, in particular in Helsinki with the weather, that inside the library will work like a series of vertical parks and public spaces, and people can do leisure activities. And the library itself will be embedded in all what we call it the Fabergé eggs. So it was a kind of a little bit, the friction between the flatness of the volume and the violation of the volume through these egg systems, and how that thing can relate and connect to a conceptual frame with the park, and the idea how the inside and the outside can become much more seamless. So of course, assuming the role, the iconicity that a project like this should have for a city like Helsinki. So this is in the center of the city. But again, the idea was to approach the almost as a landscape project, to operate the building as a three-dimensional park or a three-dimensional garden, in which you can, again, what it seems to be the public space is not, is a private, and when it seems to be the private is a public. So the park really happened in the box, so in all these levels, and the library and all the private rooms happen inside these things, the same with the auditorium. The only thing that we made part of the public is all the storage of the bookshelves. So they produce like a spine and go through all the levels. So, but the idea is the notion was to try to produce a very playful atmosphere for the library and to create like a much more contemporary notion of openness about knowledge and how that can relate to a public space and not to the accumulation. It became smaller than what it was. Now the museum itself is just that. It's only 4,500 square feet. The rest is much more like a massive outdoor park of activities. So some of the things can be built. Some of them will not be built, or maybe not will be built. So the idea is to use this notion of the rough, the low, and the end, and to treat the whole project as a series of rituals. They start to define a space of quality, but also have a way to violate a certain kind of a Platonic geometry into a much more unsettled or unfamiliar territory. So the idea is it works with certain elements that you can recognize and certain familiarities of tradition with the notion of architecture, but also with the notion of particular culture. But then to recombine it and reconfigure it in such a way that produce a kind of a very awkward or unsettled territory. So that's where the work is these days. This is where we're going. We don't know exactly what is the next phase. But for sure, the dirtiness, the mutilations, the outside influence, the outside definition of what is exterior, the technology, the technique, to me, it's absolutely critical. I think it's really important for all of you who's going into the game that you need to understand that those desires and those ambitions need to be expressed and have the technology and the methodology you control. I always say half a joke, half seriously, like, if you think of somebody like the sound of Jimi Hendrix and something like Voodoo Child, the famous bang, bang, all that, you need to do it with an electric guitar and a wah-wah pedal. I mean, you cannot do it with a Spanish guitar. You cannot do it with an acoustic guitar. It will not work. It will not be the same. So technology and techniques shape and define big chunk of the work that you will produce. But you have to be Jimi Hendrix. I mean, you can have a guitar, electric guitar and a wah-wah pedal, and you're not going to be Jimi Hendrix. I mean, you have to have the ambition, the desire to challenge the canon of what the thing is telling you. And you need to have a certain certainty and a certain kind of a healthy arrogance about what you need to do. So, to finish, I would like to finish with this clip.
Trust me. Everything's gonna be fine. Very strange time in my life.
What I love about that clip is, trust us, everything's gonna be fine, but make sure that people always met you in a very strange time of your life. Thank you.